Hello, good morning, welcome. My name's Abby Steele. Hope you're all doing well. Not long to the summer holidays now, although you wouldn't think it, would you? I've bust out a winter jumper in the middle of July because the weather is not being very summery. Anyway, let's get on with today's content. So I've done a few webinars recently that were aimed at primary, so primary phonics. And I thought, you know what, before we break up for the summer, let's do something for our secondary colleagues. So this session is called Myth Busting Phonics at Key Stage 3. And really, it's a few things that just kind of keep cropping up for me when we talk about phonics at Key Stage 3 plus. There's a lot of things that we can learn from the way that we do phonics in primary, the approaches in primary that are really successful, that we can have that same success in secondary. But also, there are some ways that it's just not the same. We just need to be a little bit more bespoke and think more carefully about secondary. So I just want to clarify a few things, really. So our plan for this session, we are going to tackle 6 myths, 6 things that we hear in phonics. And of course, some of these are designed to be written that you'll go, oh, I thought that was true. I thought that was the case. So number 1, phonics is for infants. Number 2, the best way to assess your learners is with a reading test. Number 3, you need to follow a validated systematic synthetic phonics SSP program. Number 4, you need to be trained and experienced to teach phonics. Number 5, weak readers need decodable reading books. And number 6, phonics catch-up works within 12 weeks. So let's get stuck in. Myth number 1 then, phonics is for infants. And this has really improved over the last couple of years. When I go in and do training in secondary schools, all staff, so subject-specific staff, the science staff, the PE staff, everybody is so much more open-minded and welcoming to learning about that phonics doesn't have to just be for infants. But it's no surprise that lots of adults and learners perceive phonics as something that just infants learn, because look at the resources. I mean, on the screen here, you've got some absolutely beautiful resources. These come from Rocket Phonics First Steps. And these resources are designed for learners of about 3 to maybe 5 or 6 years of age. And of course, they're totally appealing for that age group. But if you were to put these resources in front of teenagers, they're going to feel stupid. They're going to feel like you're babying them, and this is the thing that babies do. And actually, even within the phonics world, experts in phonics, people who are very positive, pro phonics, push phonics, actually there is still a belief from some of those people that phonics should just be in infants. If we did it right in infants, or if we had the children in infants, we would teach the phonics in infants and it would be done, finished, done. There would be no need for any further intervention or further phonics. I believe that phonics is actually something that should go on for longer than just infants, because when you unpick the quantity of knowledge that there is within phonics. So when you think that there are over 180 letter sound correspondences because of our complex spelling system, where one sound can be represented by multiple different graphemes, multiple ways of spelling it, it's so complex and spelling is so hard that I believe that actually phonics should actually, not as an intervention, but as a mainstream part of teaching, go on for much longer. But historically, phonics is something that's been taught to infants. People perceive it should be finished by the end of year 1, absolutely done by 6 years of age. And therefore, most resources are designed for that age group. So the truth is that phonics is for everyone, despite the fact that many adults and learners, especially in secondary schools, although like I say, it has changed a bit, perceive phonics as something that infants learn. So let's just clarify. Phonics, that is knowledge of the alphabetic code, the letter sounds, and the skills of decoding for reading and segmenting for spelling, which is sort of breaking up and building words, is the basis of how we as proficient literate adults read and write in the English language. So there are other things that come into play, of course, but the great examples to give, if you're working with some teachers in school, you can give them a reading example and a spelling example to try and demonstrate that actually when we are presented with an unknown word, we don't know that word, we will default to sounding it out. We will default to, for example, with this reading example, calceolaria integrifolia, We actually do a very quick scan through those words. It's so automatic because we're very skilled readers. We do this very quick automatic scan through. We look for chunks that we recognize, but ultimately, because English is left across to the right, we go to the left and we try to assign speech sounds to the letters or groups of letters that we see, and we try to give a pronunciation. So calciolaria. And I don't know well, I do know what those words mean because obviously I've been training this for years, but it's great to use words like this that usually people don't know the meaning of. So they can't say, I just knew that word. It was already in my vocabulary. I knew it. They have to really dig deep and think about, well, how did I read it? And there are mature skills in there. So how did we know that it wasn't cal-k? It was it was a soft C for that second letter C. And that's because we make these sort of able reader choices based on our experiences or our knowledge of other words that are similar. Interestingly, historically, those words are Latin, and it's likely that that wasn't a soft C back in the day. It was probably a hard k sound, and it's evolved over time, which is just an interesting aside. The same for a spelling example with Chaffington, and everybody talks about phonics for reading, and spelling is the poor relation, spelling and writing. And I do think more will come out, more work and more focus will come out on writing and spelling. I know I'm certainly going to do lots of work around that. But phonics is for both. Phonics is for reading and phonics is for spelling. And it's nice to give adults a spelling example. So you wouldn't show them this word, you show them no word. We go from spoken word for them to try and have a go and spell it. But you tell them, this is a word that is made up. So you can't get this spelling right and you can't get this spelling wrong. It's purely thinking about the process of how do you spell this word? How did you come to your spelling? So you say, the word I'd like you to spell is Chaffington. Chaffington. Get people to write it, get them to share with their friends and talk about it. And then you can unpick, well, how did you spell that word? What did you do? Did you know it already? No, you didn't know it already. So what did you do? Some people break it into bigger chunks, like syllable chunks. Some people go straight for, well, it's left through to right in English. So I thought about the beginning of the word, ch. I thought about the sound I was producing, and I thought about which letters represent that sound. And across a room of people, you'll get different variations of this spelling. This is my instinctive way. And then it's interesting to talk about the end of the word, because you'll notice I said Chaffington, but a lot of people, most people in the room will write ham at the end. So then you can talk about, well, why did you spell it H-A-M when I said that doesn't spell how it sounds. And of course, there is contextual, wider knowledge of place names. So a lot of people will be thinking of places like Birmingham, and that we spell Birmingham with ham at the end. So they're applying other knowledge. So it's not purely phonics, but it is largely phonics that we go back to. We go back to thinking about what other sounds of speech that I'm producing and what letters in our writing system do I need to put down to represent those sounds, and that is phonics. So even proficient literate adults use phonics. And a lot of people that I work with like those examples. It kind of helps them see, oh yeah, I do use some phonics. So it's not just a thing for infants, everybody uses phonics. It's also quite useful to show people just at a quick glance, look, this is what resources can look like that are designed for older learners. That's the same phonics. It's the same letter sounds that we teach in the infants, but here they're just presented in a more mature way. So here we've got two versions of the English alphabetic code chart. They're the same chart with the same information. One has no pictures, it's completely plain, and the other one has some pictures, which is nice and attractive, adds a bit of colour, but those pictures are not in a style of illustration designed for infants. Those pictures are in a style of illustration designed for anybody, for older learners. So those are nice reference charts. And then you've got an extract of a lesson there where the focus is j, as in treasure, the j sound. And so that's a piece of phonics, the same as you might talk about with younger children. You do, in fact, talk about the younger children. It's quite a rare piece, but we do cover it with children in year 1, so 5 to 6 years old. But, fancy having to get your head around that at 5 to 6 years old. The j, as in treasure, television, confusion, invasion, illusion, measure. And this j sound is spelled in different ways. So we've got SI in television, confusion, invasion. And we've got an S in measure and treasure and casual and usual. And then we've got a G in courgette and a Z in azure. So that's really complicated learning, which goes back to my point of perhaps it's not just for infants. We can't expect 5 and 6 year olds to nail that piece of learning. This needs to happen and be revisited and repeated as children get older. And you can see there the piece of text in that lesson. That is a meaty piece of text, actually. And, I would challenge that maybe year 6, year 7, on track mainstream learners should be working with that piece of text. So that can be an eye-opener as well to help demonstrate to people that phonics is not just for infants, phonics is for everybody. Another sort of nice piece of information to add to this, because I'm hoping that by you coming to this webinar, I'm sort of generally adding to your knowledge, your subject knowledge about phonics with older learners. Back in 2022, Ofsted released some content around phonics at secondary schools. There was a report that they did based on some research, and they shared good practice, and they wrote a very good blog post as a result of that, and they created a webinar, and they made the slides available for people. So you can download the slides to this session in the chat box, and then you can click on the link, or you can copy down this link, and you can go and get all of the Ofsted slides and have a look through that content as well. But I just pulled out a couple of nice slides because I think they, again, demonstrate this need for a bit of phonics at secondary. So they work it backwards from where secondary pupils need to be able to get to. So to fulfill the demands of the secondary school curriculum, pupils need to be able to read age-appropriate fiction and non-fiction texts fluently. So there's a big step up actually to secondary school reading for fiction and non-fiction. There's some really challenging demand on people to be able to read. But what does it take to become that fluent reader, to be able to access that secondary curriculum? Well, learners need accuracy and they need automaticity. Accuracy is about decoding unfamiliar words by saying the sounds, corresponding to the letters, and blending the sounds together. So like the example of Calceolaria integrifolia, which, by the way, is Latin for, it's a rose, and a name of a rose. But learners need to be able to decode unfamiliar words accurately. They need to have that phonics knowledge to unpick that word that they've not come across very often. It's rare, or they've just not experienced it in their journey accurately. But also they need to be able to read automatically. They need to have this automaticity that when they're looking at familiar words, the decoding is automatic. They're not overtly decoding. You don't hear them saying, it's calceolaria, or in this case, more familiar words, at a glance. And they develop that automaticity through repeated practice, experience, by rereading words that they first sounded out and blended. So if you have a struggling reader, you'll know from working with learners who are more struggling readers, you would read a sentence more than once. You'd have to judge that by the reader, but generally you'd read it more than once, or you might repeat back the sentence to them to help them hear the sort of fluency. But it's about that practice of reading and rereading. So we need this accuracy, we need this automaticity to become a fluent reader. Well, how do pupils become accurate and automatic word reader? Well, the accuracy is through phonics. Pupils learn the alphabetic code, and this allows them to decode any unfamiliar words they come across. So they need to have confidence and sort of embedded knowledge of the alphabetic code, lots and lots of experience and practice in that. And then the automaticity, once pupils can decode a word accurately, they need the right quality and quantity of practice so that they can read it automatically. So it's just lots and lots of practice. And I particularly like this slide that they show. Phonics is a body of knowledge, not a pedagogy, because you'll still find in academic circles people arguing about, phonics shouldn't be the main strategy. Phonics is one of a range of strategies. And actually, phonics isn't a strategy. Phonics is the foundations of our English language. It's a body of knowledge and the skills of decoding and segmenting. It's not a pedagogy. So I think Ofsted explained that sort of quite well. Understanding the alphabetic code, that the letters on the page represent the sounds in spoken words, underpins successful word reading. And some of the arguments come because academics quite rightly say, but there's so much more to reading. Just because you can read the words on the page doesn't make you a reader, doesn't mean you understand it, doesn't mean you really have the comprehension of what you're reading. Absolutely true. But to develop those skills, you've got to be able to read the words on the page. So if we get the reading the words on the page nailed, then we are freed up to develop all of the other skills. So myth number 2, the best way to assess your learners is with a reading test. Yes, in many respects, this is true. Reading tests are a good idea, but there isn't a single ideal test, sadly. There are lots of good tests out there on the market, but I don't feel there is particularly one that absolutely nails everything, that gives you all the information you need. Reading tests will give you a particular type of information, and it might be different information depending on the different test. Best practice, as promoted by Ofsted, as agreed, sort of the schools that I work with that are well underway with their phonics journey and doing quite well, everybody seems to agree that best practice is to have some sort of plan where when pupils come to you, you screen them all. And that could be using information from their previous key stage, plus reading tests, whatever reading tests that you use. Then you would look more closely at those you are concerned about. So you would look at your data, you'd pick out all the learners that you thought, oh, I'd like to look more closely at those. And then you would use a diagnostic test, e.g. something from your phonics program or a word reading test, and hear them read, which I know is really ambitious. It's really difficult, especially in a big secondary school, to be able to have that time to get around and hear your readers. But there are lots of schools now doing things like actually they do something a bit different for the first 6 weeks that enables time. It creates time to be able to assess and hear readers before starting in October on intervention programs. Or they have an expectation, for example, that during tutor time, each day, you as the tutor would hear one learner read. And the school the other day was talking about how that they'd implemented this hear one learner read, and to do that you would go and sit at the back of the class, so that it's not a feeling of that the learners come to the front and everybody can see them. You would go with the learner to the back, and then you can see your class in front of you whilst you're listening to this reader. And teachers reported back that the first session was a bit kind of uncomfortable because the learners weren't used to it. They hadn't started it from the beginning of the year. They implemented it partway through the year, but that very, very quickly everybody was enjoying it. Teachers were enjoying it, learners were enjoying it, and teachers were loving being able to hear children read and get to know them a bit better that way. And I cannot emphasize to you enough that teacher judgment is absolutely vital. And again, I know it's hard trying to get to know all of those learners in a secondary school, but your professional judgment about what's going on with them and what they need and what's best for them is absolutely crucial, really, really important. Myth number 3 then. You need to follow a validated systematic synthetic phonics program. So SSP standing for systematic synthetic phonics. And I get asked this question quite a lot. People get in touch and say, is your work validated? Do you, who can you recommend a validated program? But categorically, under the DFE validation process in 2021, Key Stage 3 phonics programs were not invited to apply. The validation process didn't apply to those programs, nor did they apply to SEND materials. The validation was only for mainstream, early years and Key Stage 1 programs. That was it. So it is not possible to have a validated Key Stage 3 program. You can obviously do sensible choices. So for example, my work, my Key Stage 3 program isn't explicitly validated, but as a trainer I am, and as an author through Rocket Phonics I am. So that kind of gives you a bit of a quality stamp. But it also gives you a bit of freedom of you can experiment with different materials and use things that you find that are good. So just to clarify a bit of the terminology here, systematic synthetic phonics refers to breaking the language down into its smallest components. For example, by teaching S as the S and P as the P. There is no need to teach what we call a cluster or a blend, SPA, the S and the P together, SPA as a discrete unit. That actually adds another 76 units of teaching. So historically, and there might be materials you come across in your school that are more analytic phonics or old-fashioned types of phonics that use these clusters or units or a different way of teaching phonics. And it's not that they're terrible at all. It's just to explain to you that this modern definition of systematic synthetic phonics is referring to materials and programs that break the units into their smallest component, the smallest unit, because it's a more efficient way of teaching. Okay. It's a good idea. It is a good idea to follow a systematic synthetic phonics program, but I've crossed out the validated. So the validated bit is the bit of the myth that's not relevant. So following a program is advisable because of its systematic nature. Programs have been designed to start on day 1, go to day 2, go to day 3. There's that systematic nature to them. And we know in phonics across primary and secondary that routines and consistency are really effective. Gaps can be plugged and old learning consolidated. So you have a bit of a choice with older learners, because when you look at older learners and you might do a gap analysis, what are their gaps? What are the bits that they're missing? You can either plug the gaps only. So you would look at an assessment, look at which bits of phonics knowledge they don't have, and then you teach to those gaps. So you pick the lessons out of the program and teach that only. Or I generally, if you've got the time available, prefer that you would just work systematically through from page 1 all the way through all the pages, because that way you're not going to miss anything and you will be plugging gaps, but actually old learning will be being consolidated. And sometimes that's quite nice for them to think, yeah, I do know this bit already. This is just consolidation, but I'm practicing my routine. I'm practicing my skills. But you won't miss anything. It builds up so cumulatively. That can be a really sort of solid way to work. So either of those ways is fine. Following a program reduces teacher planning and preparation and the risk of missing aspects. Traditionally, certainly in primary school, when teachers were left to create their own programs, following guidance, but creating their own materials and their own lessons, their own stuff to use, there were sometimes missed aspects. So one of the skills wasn't practiced as much as another skill. Or the quality of the materials wasn't necessarily as good as a program that's been worked on by lots of experts. And of course, phonics can be taught systematically following a program, but also incidentally at any time by anyone as required. And if you use something like an alphabetic code chart, that is a resource. It's a sort of self-help resource for teachers and learners that they can reference and look at the spellings and the sounds. And that's something that could be across any lesson at any time. It doesn't just have to stay in the intervention session. So this is kind of a conceptual idea that, yes, we might follow a systematic body of work, but that's not all we do. We also, through training and through materials like a code chart, we equip our teachers and our students to learn phonics incidentally at any time by anyone as required. Supports everyone. Now, another thing to think about is this idea of fidelity. So advisors and program trainers will talk about fidelity to your phonics program. This came from Sir Jim Rose in 2006 when he did a review into the teaching of early reading, and he wrote a fantastic report, the Rose Review, which really pulled together a lot of research and practice and laid out, what was good practice. And he talked about that you should have this fidelity to your program, and that means don't mix methods within phonics programs that might confuse your learners. So if you use one brand of program, you might sing some songs. And if you use another brand of program, you might do some actions. And those songs and actions might compete against each other because you're trying to use two mnemonic systems. So thinking about fidelity means listen to the guidance of your program because it is there for a reason. However, when it comes to Key Stage 3 plus, when it comes to secondary school, you can build lessons around a phonics program. So take on board the advice of the phonics program, but actually your learners' needs are messier. There are more gaps. There are different needs for different reasons. So a phonics program as is might be absolutely perfect for those learners, but a phonics program as is might not hit the mark across all of the areas that your learners need. For example, a phonics program will include vocabulary, but your learners might need more vocabulary. A phonics program will include some basic comprehension, but your learners might need much more work on comprehension. You might want to build an intervention lesson that uses the phonics program, follows that systematic nature, but also you create links with what's going on with the mainstream teaching for those learners. So, for example, in English, are there class novels that the whole year group are learning about? Your learners can't access those class novels because they can't read them. But could you do some work in your intervention session where you read some of that novel to them, or you use extracts from that novel to find words with the phonics content that you've been learning about in your phonics program that day? So you can enhance your phonics program and tweak your phonics program. You're still showing fidelity, but fidelity has to be taken with caution at secondary school because you have to be able to apply your teacher judgment. So you understand about fidelity, you take the guidance on board, but actually, ultimately, you've got responsibility for your learners' outcomes. And if you are following a phonics program and it's not hitting the mark for all the areas your learners need, that's on your head. It's not on the program. So please have the confidence to think about that and tweak that and play around with what an intervention session looks like for your learners. Here's a really nice example actually of this. So at the bottom of the Ofsted blog that was back in 2022, and there's a link for that coming up so you can go and have a look at that if you want, this lady called Catherine Driver had put a comment underneath. Perhaps Ofsted could acknowledge the specific issues for schools planning support for readers who have English as an additional language, e.g. refugees and asylum seekers from countries such as Syria, Afghanistan and Ukraine. In many cases, these older pupils can already read in their first language or another script, and rather than remedial phonics programs, they need specialist support from an EAL bilingual teacher who can quickly explain the differences between the alphabetic codes. Of course, they also need time to acquire spoken vocabulary before focusing on reading. We do not expect native English speakers to read the language before they can speak it. So I don't entirely agree with what Catherine says there, but the essence of what she says is correct. So for me, I would argue that actually it's not that they need a remedial phonics program, they need a phonics program. If you're going to learn to read and write in the English language, the most efficient, the quickest way to do it is to start with the phonics. But for these EAL learners, what's super important is that alongside the phonics, they also have loads and loads of spoken vocabulary, oral opportunities, vocabulary enrichment. They need that alongside. So it's not that they need something else first. It's not that they need something different. It's that they need the phonics program to be able to literally decode the language. But at the same time, they're going to have a much higher demand on what the word meanings are and then what the comprehension of the text is. They need much more support with that. Okay, myth number 4. You need to be trained and experienced to teach phonics. Now, I love that Ofsted have high-profiled this message. In many respects, of course you do. I totally agree. The best teaching is going to come when you are trained and you are experienced, without a shadow of a doubt. And it's great. You know, Ofsted have high-profiled it. They've been asking it in inspections. Are your staff trained? Are all of your staff trained? Does every member of staff in your school understand that every teacher is a teacher of reading? Is anybody taking an intervention trained and with some experience? So absolutely, a trained and experienced adult will be more confident at teaching phonics and more confident at things like adapting the lessons on the spot. So being able to make those on the spot tweaks to make the lesson flow or to react to what your learners need. However, I believe that a good phonics program can be implemented by any adult with no experience nor training. The program itself will guide and teach the adult at the point of teaching. When I first became a teacher many years ago, I did a degree in teaching, specialising in English. primary degree specializing in English, primary education, I was not taught how to teach reading and writing. I was not taught how to use phonics. I discovered for myself when I went into the classroom, I didn't have a clue what I was doing and I was really struggling and I had to seek out help and look for it, research things. And I came across a phonics program. And every day that I followed the phonics program and taught the lessons, I was teaching myself at the same time as teaching the learners. So a good quality phonics program can be followed by an adult with no training and no experience, and they will learn the phonics as they teach the phonics. It's still fantastic, obviously, to have the training, and it's fantastic for everybody to have all of this focus on reading, that's been going on across schools. The problem comes when people wait. They say, well, we can't start the interventions yet. We can't start running that group yet or that program. We're waiting for our training. We haven't all been trained yet. And you mustn't wait. So don't wait for training before getting started because learners are missing out. You're missing really precious teaching time. So training experience, great, but don't wait. Get on with it. Myth number 5, weak readers need decodable reading books. And actually, the whole point of me wanting to do a webinar on sort of myths in Key Stage 3 phonics was about this. This is something that I think we're going to see more of, and this is something that I am going to do more work around. In primary school, we've had a message loud and clear, which is a fantastic and important message. It was in the Reading Framework 2021. And this fantastic and important message, backed up by Ofsted and what Ofsted are looking for, is that we should not be asking learners to read texts or to read books that they cannot yet read. If we ask, let's say children, if we ask a child of any age to read something, it is cruel to put something in front of them and say, read it, when we haven't given them the skills to read what we're putting in front of them. And that's what sometimes happens, purely because we're caught up in the what we should be reading or the what the curriculum says or where we want them to be. And it was a really important shift in, you need to make sure that the book you put in front of that learner, you've given them beforehand all of the skills. So all of the phonics knowledge they need and the decoding skill to be able to access that book. Then you can expect them to read it. It's different if you're doing like a shared read, you're reading together, or if you're reading to the children, that's different. Heavily supported, you can pitch a bit higher. But if you expect a learner to independently read something, you have to know that you've previously taught and that they have that phonics knowledge and skill of decoding to be able to access that text. So it led to a movement in primary schools where teachers were scrutinised much more vigorously on, have you matched the right book with the learner? Can they access it? Why are you giving little Timmy a book about going to the cinema in the city when in your phonics lessons you haven't reached teaching that soft C yet? So how can he possibly read those words? Some very able readers can read well ahead of what you've taught them in phonics. It's called set for variability. Some able readers self-teach because they can use other reading cues. They can use the sentence or the context or the picture, and they can learn the word cinema and city, and they deduce it for themselves, and then they know it. And that's incredible. But we know now that we have a lot of readers who that doesn't come easy for them. They can't do that. They need much more support. So we provide the book that matches the teaching. So really, really simple example. If you are in reception and you've just taught your learners at, ip, n, that's usually the first group of 6-letter sounds, which we can sat pin sounds, at, ip, n. Then you could give them a book and it would have sat, at, pin, pan, pat, ant, because you've taught them those letter sounds. So you know that they can access that. It's much more complicated with older learners because they've likely been through phonics or parts of the alphabetic code multiple times in their education. So it's not as simple as saying, well, they know this and they don't know that. So they can have a book at this level, but they can't have a book at that level. It's much more complicated based on why they're having phonics, what the reasons are, and what else is missing. So it's really not as simple as saying, well, in phonics, in the phonics program, we did an assessment, we found the gaps, we're starting at this point in the program, this is the level, so we're going to give a book that directly matches that. They've likely got more knowledge than that. So it depends on the learner's reading needs. It also depends at Key Stage 3 Plus on the learner's reading preferences. There is nothing worse than giving an older learner a book that you think is right because it's decodable and it's super low level, and they take one look at it and it looks babyish, or they're so embarrassed by the low level, they are instantly switched off. And of course, we know that when learners are motivated, they want to read, they have a purpose and they enjoy the content, they like that topic, that's going to really incentivize them to read a bit more. So it is a much harder thing to do at secondary than it is at primary. Learners are motivated by success in reading. So texts need to be appropriately matched to reading ability, because when they read that text, when they read the words on the page, if they can't read them, instantly turned off. If they can actually read those words and understand them, they're going to be motivated. But it's got to be married up with learners are demotivated by reading for no purpose or reading texts that they perceive as boring. And it's their perception. It's not our perception, it's their perception. So this is a really hard task. And I'm really planning to go into the next academic year doing loads of work around this, because I think it's an area that we could all do with a bit more support on. So the truth of the myth: weak readers need carefully matched reading books, not necessarily decodable. It depends on what's going on with them. Learners need an abundance of reading practice. You do need to remember as well that the reading practice can be provided through small texts within the phonics program. So if you remember back on the slide where I showed you what phonics resources can look like for older learners, there was a piece of text in that lesson. That is reading practice. So because you've got that reading practice in the phonics program, that takes the pressure off a bit, having to provide that exact level of reading practice in a book. The book can have a little bit more flexibility. Many Key Stage 3 learners have patchy phonics knowledge, they have gaps, or they actually have reasonable phonics knowledge. So they have basic word decoding, they have some accuracy, but they've not had enough reading practice at lower levels to become automatic and therefore do not have fluency. And that can really muddy the water sometimes, because sometimes people will say they know the phonics. When I show them the graphemes or I do the flashcards, they know all of the sounds. They can read the words, but they can't read it in a book. And that's because they need simply way more practice at those very low text reading levels to enable them to build that automaticity and build that stamina and build that fluency. So learners do not necessarily need decodable books matched to the phonics they know or the phonics level that they're working at in the program that you might just be doing very systematically to cover all bases. Learners might struggle with phonics accuracy, but actually they've built coping strategies that enable them to struggle read. And I call it struggle read because sometimes you've got the situation I just described where they know the phonics, but they're not very fluent, they're not automatic. Sometimes you have learners who actually they read at not too bad a level, they struggle read, you can see it's hard for them and uncomfortable, but they're kind of automatic. They skip a lot of words, they make quite a lot of substitutions and errors, but they get through the text, they understand some of the text. But when you look at their phonics isolated, they don't have the accuracy, they don't have the phonics. They've simply built coping strategies over the years that have got them through. So a phonics decodable book might be too much of a backward step for some learners. An accessible book might be a better match. So we're being more fluid with accessible, decodable, lower level, what is it? Sometimes, and this could be for the same learner, sometimes you want a book for easier decoding, but with more content to build stamina. Sometimes you want a more challenging book for word decoding, but less content to be easier on the demand. So here's a couple of examples. I am currently working with Peters, the bookseller in Birmingham. They are a really fantastic bookseller. They sell to schools and they are really good at putting together book packs and organizing books. And we're putting together some book packs. So we're doing lots of exploring books out there. And I asked them to put me together some book packs. What would they recommend for really low level sort of decodable readers for older learners? And it was really interesting, the mixture of books that they provided for me. So this is an example where I would argue that because there's a photograph on page 8 of a younger child, it gives this book a younger feel. It's quite a cool, funky, trendy looking book, so that might really appeal to some learners. It's colourful, deadly diseases, that's a pretty cool topic. And you've got not a lot of text. However, there's not a lot of text, but I would argue that white font on a dark colour background is quite hard for the eyes to process. And the font is an unusual looking font, so that could be hard for some children to process and read. And the phonics words we've got here, leprosy and diseases, damages, themselves, injure. There's some pretty tricky words there, actually. So I would argue this is slightly more challenging content, but it's less content, so it's not going to build that stamina. So this might be perfect, and a child might really appeal to this. Others would look at this and go, bit babyish, isn't it? That's not for me. That's far too babyish. I want something that looks more grown up. Here's another example, and absolutely pertinent that I just chose this. I think this book is going to do very well, by Mallory Blackman, amazing, called A Dangerous Game. And this is a Barrington Stoke book, so it's aimed at children who might have dyslexic tendencies. So I really like this book, the way that it's presented as the space on the page. So I like reading text like this, where it's a bit more spaced out. And I'm a good reader, but sometimes books, if they have really dense text, it just, scrambles your eyeballs. But actually, when you look at this text and sort of explore the words in there, okay, we've got plunged, maybe downwards. There are a few words here, exhausted, maybe anorak. There's a few words there that you think they could be a bit challenging, but actually there's an awful lot of words here that are more familiar words, and this would help to build up that automaticity, because there's actually a lot of repetition of words in this book as well. So it's the same words and they're used multiple times to give that multiple practice without having to read the same sentence over and again. And I think this book is going to do very well when people realise that not only is it by Mallory Blackman, but on the back of the book it tells you about some of the themes, and the themes are school trip, bullies, and sickle cell. And there is a new series just come out on Netflix called Supercell. And Supercell is about people who have sickle cell, but actually they have superpowers. So either they have sickle cell or their family members do. It's linked anyway. So I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this is, it's going to be so popular with youngsters. I don't know what the age rating is, I can't remember, but it was a really good superhero show. And this has a bit of a link to it. So if you know that kind of information, that's the kind of thing that you can recommend or talk about with your students. So I really like this Dangerous Game book. But for some learners, they might look at that and go, oh gosh, all of those words, that's too much text. So it might be absolutely better to have something like this one. And there are so many different books out there, loads and loads of different types of books, that we just need to really get more knowledgeable about books to be able to recommend, not just recommending the topics that we think learners will like, but recommending based on how they read, what we see and what we know their difficulties are. Do they need work on the accuracy? Do they need work on the automaticity? Are we building up the fluency? Do they need work on the comprehension? What is it that we need to do with them? And the final myth, myth number 6, phonics catch-up works within 12 weeks. So here on the screen, we've got an extract from this blog post that went out in April 2022. And there's also the link there so that you can go and see that blog post online. It was written by Jill Jones for Ofsted, and it's a really nice blog, very, very readable. And she puts in this blog, so it's important that assessment checks exactly which aspects of reading that pupils are struggling with, whether weaker readers are having difficulty reading words accurately or automatically, is what we were just talking about. This makes sure that you can target extra support effectively. For example, pupils who can't read unfamiliar words accurately will need phonics teaching. I would argue that pupils who can't read automatically would also need phonics teaching because they need that practice at that lower level of reading. Anyway, regardless of age, special educational need or background, the same knowledge of the alphabetic code and the phonics skills underpins all reading. This is the bit. Intensive practice should soon make sure that pupils can read age-appropriate texts accurately and automatically. It's the should soon make sure. And there's another reference in there about the speed, and it's talking about phonics as catch-up. It's saying if you put in this intensive burst of phonics intervention, your pupils will be back on track in no time at all. Just give them this boost and they'll be fine. So phonics intervention can have rapid impact. I've seen it myself tons of times. Absolutely, it can be a magic answer. It happens really quickly. But you need to look more closely at why the phonics is needed as a teaching intervention this late. So why are children needing this in secondary? I know I mentioned earlier that phonics should be going on, but that would be in a light touch way throughout their education. Why are they needing this intensive boost when it comes to secondary school? Is it because they are English as a new language or English as an additional language? Is it because they have special educational needs or disabilities and therefore they've got learning needs, processing needs, or memory difficulties? Has that been the problem? Is it emotional behavioural difficulties? Is it gaps in school attendance or many changes, many transitions going on for them? There are all sorts of reasons that your students are not reading as they should be. And a school actually said to me not that long ago, we've run a 12-week intervention. And whilst there was progress, there was actually a lot of progress, they were very happy, we feel learners would benefit from another 12 weeks. But in our school, interventions are supposed to be short and impactful. So in their school, the way that they'd always done interventions is screen children, diagnose children, put them on a 12-week plan, boom, intervention done, they're back in class, and they might pick different children to have an intervention on something different. And I understand, there's loads of things people might need intervention on, and it's hard to kind of organise all of the learners having all these interventions. But actually, fancy putting people onto a 12-week intervention and it's working, and then you stop. Like, that's heartbreaking. And my advice to them was, please don't stop. Please go back and say, this is working for these learners. Look how far they've come. Imagine how far they will get in another 12 weeks. And they're not back on track. They were so far behind. There's so much progress to make. It's not going to happen in 12 weeks. They need another 12 weeks on the intervention, please, to really get to where you want them to be. So whilst phonics can be a quick catch-up intervention, absolutely, I think we need to be open about the fact that it might be a much longer pathway, and that's okay, and that's normal. So if children are EAL, it might take longer because alongside the phonics, they need vocabulary and they need comprehension. So the intervention isn't just a phonics where it's going to be quick and short and sharp. They need a different lesson building around that for them to get to meet their needs. If they are SEND with learning, processing, or memory difficulties, it might take longer because the learner's capacity for progress is simply much slower, and therefore it's going to take longer. Where one learner might need to practice something 2 or 3 times, the next learner might need to practice it 85 times before it really embeds and they really get it. And that's okay. But isn't it better to just keep going with that so that they get there in the end? If they have emotional behavioural difficulties, it might take longer because the learner takes longer to engage or is less predictable. There are loads of students that we work with where before we start the phonics intervention, we've got to get them to a place where they're willing to sit in a chair, or they're willing to listen, or they're willing to learn. Or they might be on it one week and the next week something's happened and there's no chance. They're not in the mind frame for learning. And so there are those complications. Or if there are gaps in school attendance or many changes, it might take longer if there are still attendance barriers. If you have a student who's there 1 minute, not the next minute, how can you have that impact when you don't have that consistency in that routine with them? Now, taking longer will frustrate you if you're thinking about your GCSEs. And of course, I get it, in secondary school, we are thinking about, right, how can we get our year 7s and our year 8s sorted? Because we've got to get onto our GCSE program. We've got to, really try and get them through these GCSEs. But it's highly likely in your mainstream secondary school, you have students who they're following that mainstream path, but really they have quite a lot of additional needs. And our goal for them isn't necessarily GCSEs. Our goal for them, morally, ethically, holistically, might be better and more realistic, thinking about their life skills and their functional literacy. We don't think Molly is going to get a GCSE. We'd love her to. We're ambitious. We'll try everything we can. We'll put her through the programme. But actually, when she leaves our school, we would like her to be able to read a letter that comes in the post. We'd like her to be able to understand the voting cards, which is a nightmare. We'd like her to be able to understand a menu or a street sign or a bus timetable. We would like her to have the functional literacy skills she needs to function in the workplace, to do an email, to read or to write an email. So your goals might come into this and thinking about, again, each individual learner. So a little summary to finish off. Truth number 1, phonics is for everyone. Truth number 2, the best way to assess your learners is to screen them all, then diagnose them, and there isn't particularly the right test for all of these things. You can explore different tests, and then listen to them read. That's so valuable, listening to them read. And not just as a once-off. If you can build that into your provision moving forwards in your school, it's wonderful. Truth number 3, it is a good idea to follow a systematic synthetic phonics program, but also be aware of building your provision to meet your learners' specific needs. Truth number 4, training and experience is great, very good, but it shouldn't be a barrier. Truth number 5, learners need books carefully matched to their reading profile. And truth number 6, phonics can have a rapid impact, but it is often a longer pathway. And that doesn't mean it's not working. It's just that the gap might be so big that it takes longer to get to where you want to be. So those are our 6 truths against our 6 myths. And that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, you're very welcome to put them in the chat box and I can answer them now. Or you can pop back at any time and add anything to the chat box. Occasionally I go back through webinars and see if anybody's added anything and then I can answer things. You can also contact me on hello@abigailsteeletraining.com. And like I said, in the chat box, you will find a download link to the slides. And remember that within those slides, you've got download links to send you onto the internet to go and get that Ofsted blog and the Ofsted slide deck as well, if you want a bit more information. So any questions, guys, before we sign off? I never know whether to say, oh, well, there's no questions that have started typing, let's go, or whether to think like, oh, just imagine if somebody's like typing now and I go, okay, no questions, I'm off now then, bye. Also have a think about moving into next year. I've told you some of my priorities. I would like to think about books for low-level readers at Key Stage 3 and really unpicking those. Thanks, Joe. Thanks so much for coming and listening. I'm going to do lots of work around books next year, but if you think of any other topics you would like me to talk about, anything that's useful, then do drop me a line and let me know, and we'll start building next year's programme of CPD. Right then, everybody, have a fabulous day, and if I don't speak to you sooner, have a fabulous summer, and see you all again soon.